You can use cell array in a function definition to allow the variable number of inputs or the variable number of outputs. The cell array VAR-ARGIN is used to represent the variable number of inputs. The cell array VAR-ARGOUT is used to represent the variable number of outputs. And if you don't want to use the variable number of outputs, for example, you can use a regular output argument list. This is the same for the inputs. So this function will do the following. It just tests the use of variable number of input and output. And if there are n inputs and m outputs, then the output of the function will be, in sequence, is the number of provided inputs, the number of provided outputs, and then followed by the first input, second input, so on and so forth. The number of outputs will be determined by the number of output variables used when you call this function. So this is how it does inside this function. First of all, it will always output at least one outputs. So this output will be the number of input variables. And we're going to use NARGIN to get that value. So this will be assigned to the VAR-ARGOUT, this cell array and its first element content. Next, we'll check to see if the output list has more than one output variable available. If that's the case, then the second output variable will be assigned the number of output variables. And next, we're going to calculate the minimum of the number of inputs and the number of outputs minus 2. This is because that we already used 2 outputs to hold the values of the number of inputs and the number of outputs. And next, if this n has a value greater than or equal to 1, then we do the following. We will copy the value of inputs to the variable that is the k plus 2 in index. And here you just check that we use curly brackets because we're going to use a content of this cell array. So in that case, we just output the input values directly as the output. Now let's take a look of how it works. For example, I'm going to say we're going to use A, B, C, D. And then we're going to provide 3 inputs. Let's see, one is test, is a character vector. The second will be a numerical value. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. The third will be a logical value. And if we do so, you will see that there will be 3 inputs, 4 outputs, and then because there's only 2 output variables available here, we will get the first 2 input value. And if we want to get all of them, all you have to do is to supply one more variable here. Let's say E. And then we hit enter. You'll see everything will be here. 3 inputs, 5 outputs. The first input value is test. The second is 1, 2, 3. The third is logical true. This is another example to use cell array to accept variable number of inputs in a function. And this function will do the following. It will take any pairs of x and y vector and to plot multiple lines in one axis. If the title of the axis is provided at the end of the input list, then it will use that title as the axis title. Otherwise, it will use the character vector called default title as the title of the axis. And also, the minimum number of inputs must be 2 so that it can plot at least one line. The output of the function is an error code. And the error code is very simple. It has only 2 values. If it is 0, meaning no error occurred. If it's 1, meaning there is an error occurred, and this error is insufficient inputs, which means you provide only one or none inputs. So this is how we did in the function. First, we need to check if the inputs are at least 2. So we use NARGIN as the input numbers. And if it is greater than or equal to 2, then we do the following. Otherwise, we say there is error. So we return the error ID as 1. So let's look back to see in the case that the number of inputs is sufficient. Now, because the inputs are in pairs and they are x and y vectors of the same size, so if the title of the axis is provided, then the total number of inputs will be an odd number. So we just need to check if the number of inputs is odd number, then we will take that title, which is the last input. So the way to verify if the number is odd is to use the remainder function, REM, and if the remainder is not 0, which means the remainder divided by 2 is not 0, then we know that the last value in the input list is the title. So we get that to my title, and then we know the total number of inputs that for plot is actually the total number of input to this function minus 1. And then if we don't find that there's the title provided, we just set the title as default title. Now, at this point, we know the total number of inputs for the plot function is the total number of inputs provided. And later, we can use this cell array directly as the input to the plot function, because you know the plot function allows a variable number of inputs. So if you use the cell array to supply the inputs directly, that would be fine. And next, we just need to provide the title to the axis. And lastly, we set the error ID as 0. Now, let's go back to here to check how the function is running. These are the statements to create 2 vectors. One is x vector, the other is 2 y vectors of sine x and cosine x, and then we're going to plot it without the title. Here we go. So the title will be default title, and the error ID will be 0. Next, we're going to provide the title text, which is a character vector called a test. And then, if we run it, you will see the title changed, and also the error ID is 0. Lastly, we only provide one input. And in this case, if we run it, nothing will happen except the error ID will be 1.